Evolution is a slow process, but some people are in a rush to hit the reset button. From venomous facelifts to amateur bomb disposal, we're counting down 10 individuals who looked common sense directly in the eye and said, "No thanks." This is a tribute to the decisions you should absolutely never replicate. Let's see who voluntarily removed themselves from the gene pool. 1. The venomous facelift. The pursuit of eternal youth has driven humanity to do some truly insane things. We've bathed in donkey milk, injected botulism into our foreheads, and electrocuted our own faces. But Eleanor, a wealthy socialite with more money than survival instincts, decided that the secret to immortality was hiding inside the fangs of a creature that evolution specifically designed to kill mammals. Eleanor was obsessed with Mithridatism, the ancient practice of building immunity to poison through small, controlled doses. But she wasn't doing this to survive an assassination attempt. She was doing it because she read on a dark corner of the internet that snake venom was the ultimate organic youth serum. Her logic, which was roughly as solid as a soup sandwich, was that the mild swelling from a bite would plump her wrinkles naturally, while the venom would kickstart her immune system into some sort of regenerative overdrive. To facilitate this DIY medical disaster, she adopted Cuddles, a Russell's viper, which is a snake famous for two things: having a terrible temper and possessing venom that turns human blood into strawberry jam. For months, Eleanor treated this lethal predator like a scaly esthetician. She would annoy Cuddles just enough to get a dry bite or a low-yield nip on her arm, treating the subsequent swelling like a successful Botox session. Her friends watched in horror as she boasted about her all-natural glow, which was actually just the early stages of tissue necrosis, but Eleanor was convinced she had hacked the aging process. The tragedy and the stupidity peaked on the night of her annual gala. Feeling that she looked a bit tired and needing a radiance boost, Eleanor decided to up her dosage. She didn't just annoy Cuddles, she aggressively harassed the snake, practically demanding a double shot of espresso for her veins. Cuddles, who had been remarkably patient up to this point, finally decided that his contract as a beauty consultant was void. He didn't deliver a cosmetic nip. He struck with the full, unbridled fury of a wild animal, injecting a massive, lethal load of hemotoxic venom directly into her main artery. This wasn't a beauty treatment. It was a biological demolition. The plumping effect happened immediately, but not in the way Eleanor wanted. Her arms swelled to the size of a traffic cone, and her internal organs began to liquefy. By the time the paramedics arrived, they weren't dealing with a patient. They were dealing with a rapidly failing chemistry experiment. Eleanor did achieve a form of eternal youth, strictly speaking, because she stopped aging that very night at 42. She stands as a permanent cautionary reminder that while beauty is pain, stupidity is lethal, and if your skincare routine requires you to antagonize a death noodle, you should probably just stick to moisturizer. 2. The Ballistic Recycling Program. Now, let's take a trip to the deep, dense woods of rural Washington state, a place where self-reliance is a religion, and the phrase, "I can fix it myself," is practically a constitutional right. This brings us to Gary, a man who viewed proper hazardous waste disposal not as a safety requirement, but as a government conspiracy to steal his hard-earned cash. Gary had a problem: a rusty 500-gallon propane tank sitting in his backyard like a metallic pimple on the face of nature. It was old, it was ugly, and it was still half full of highly explosive gas. A normal person would call a professional removal service, pay the fee, and sleep soundly. Gary, however, was a visionary of bad ideas. He looked at the tank, then he looked at his high-powered hunting rifle, and he did some mental math that would make a physics professor weep. His plan was delightfully simple. He would shoot the tank from a safe distance to ventilate it, let the gas escape, and then sell the scrap metal. He measured out a distance of 30 yards, which for the record is a great distance for throwing a frisbee, but a suicidally short distance for engaging in ballistic warfare with a pressurized vessel. Gary took his position behind a flimsy plywood shed, leveled his rifle, and treated the propane tank like a deer that owed him money. He didn't consider the internal pressure psi. He didn't consider the structural integrity of rusty steel. And he certainly didn't consider the laws of thermodynamics, which were about to enforce themselves with extreme prejudice. He squeezed the trigger. The bullet struck the tank with pinpoint accuracy. Now, in movies, propane tanks explode in a slow, cinematic fireball that the hero walks away from without looking back. In reality, physics is much ruder and much faster. The bullet compromised the structural integrity of the pressurized tank, causing a catastrophic, instantaneous rupture. It didn't just explode, it disintegrated. The force of the expanding gas ripped the metal casing apart, turning the tank into a fragmentation grenade the size of a Volkswagen. One specific piece of shrapnel, a jagged, heavy chunk of the tank's collar, was launched backward along the exact trajectory of the bullet, as if guided by a vengeful spirit of recycling. It covered the 30 yards in a fraction of a second. Gary didn't even have time to lower his rifle before the metal boomerang returned to sender. The impact was precise, devastating, and final. The police report later noted that Gary had successfully disposed of the tank, as it was now scattered over 3 counties. Unfortunately, he had also disposed of himself in the process. It was a classic case of problem-solving gone wrong. He saved $50 on disposal fees but paid the ultimate price for a lesson in ballistics. The lesson? If your garbage requires a sniper rifle to remove, you're doing chores wrong. 3. The Honest Escapologist. There is a fine line between bravery and delusion, and in the competitive world of street performance, that line is often crossed for the sake of a few euros thrown into a hat. Enter Pierre, a Parisian escapologist who felt that his act was becoming too stale, too safe, and frankly too survivable. The crowds on the banks of the River Seine were growing bored with his standard handcuff routines. They wanted real danger, real stakes, and the possibility of witnessing a tragedy. So Pierre decided to escalate. He announced his grand finale, the watery grave, a stunt where he would be chained, padlocked, and sealed inside a wooden crate, which would then be unceremoniously dumped into the murky waters of the Seine. To add an extra layer of authenticity to the proceedings, Pierre made a fatal marketing error. He promised the audience escape-proof locks. Usually in the magic business, escape-proof is a lie. You buy trick locks that pop open if you sneeze on them correctly. But Pierre, in a fit of artistic integrity or perhaps immense hubris, went to a high-end industrial hardware store and bought actual, heavy-duty, hardened steel security padlocks. These were locks designed to keep determined burglars out of diamond vaults, not to be picked by a man holding his breath underwater with a bobby pin. On the day of the performance, the atmosphere was electric. The crowd watched as Pierre was shackled with the legitimate hardware. He gave a confident thumbs up, the lid was nailed shut, and the crate was hoisted into the air. Splash. The box vanished beneath the green water. The timer started. 1 minute passed. The crowd cheered, loving the dramatic tension. 2 minutes passed. The cheering wavered slightly. 3 minutes passed and the bubbles stopped surfacing. Inside the box, Pierre was discovering a horrifying truth. Truth in advertising is a dangerous thing. The locks were exactly as described. They were robust, well-made, and completely indifferent to his panic. His pick snapped in the first keyhole because, surprise, you cannot pick a military-grade lock in pitch blackness while your lungs are collapsing. He wasn't fighting a trick. He was fighting refined steel engineering with a limited oxygen supply. He had essentially mailed himself to the bottom of the river with no return address. The triumphant splash never came. By the time the emergency divers, who were actually part of the audience and realized the show had gone on too long, hauled the crate back up, the performance was over in the most permanent sense. Pierre had proven his point. The locks were indeed escape-proof. He died a victim of his own honesty, a martyr to the quality assurance of the locksmith industry. The police had to use hydraulic bolt cutters to get his body out, confirming that while Pierre was a mediocre magician, he was an excellent shopper for security hardware. 4. The Winter Olympics are a global celebration of human athleticism, national pride, and the uncanny ability of people to slide on frozen water at 80 miles per hour without dying. But for a certain adrenaline junkie in Germany, let's call him Hans, the Olympic track was less of a sporting venue and more of a personal playground that was rudely locked at night. Hans was a man who viewed safety regulations not as rules written in blood, but as suggestions, written by lawyers who hated fun. He was the type of guy who looked at a high-voltage sign and wondered if it tickled. His specific brand of madness involved a bicycle, a vehicle famously designed for friction, tarmac, and stopping distances, and a bobsled track, a venue designed for zero friction, polished ice, and gravity-induced terror. Now, anyone who has passed high school physics, or simply walked on a frozen sidewalk, knows that rubber tires and sheer ice have a relationship best described as non-existent. But Hans, in a stroke of genius that can only be described as terminal, decided that breaking into the Oberhof bobsled track at 2 a.m. for a solo run was the ultimate thrill. He ignored the fences, he ignored the locked gates, and he most certainly ignored the massive danger signs, which in German are usually very long, very specific, and very scary. He hauled his mountain bike to the top of the starting chute, staring down into the icy abyss like a gladiator about to fight a lion armed only with a spoon. In his mind, he was about to perform a legendary stunt that would make him a viral sensation. In reality, he was about to volunteer for a brutal physics experiment involving kinetic energy and blunt force trauma. He pushed off. The first few seconds probably felt exhilarating. The wind in his hair, the tires gripping the initial frost. But then, gravity, which is a harsh and unforgiving mistress, took over. As the slope increased, so did his speed. A bobsled steers by banking high on the walls, using centrifugal force and steel runners to stay upright. A bicycle, however, relies on the friction of tires against the road to steer. On ice, there is no friction. Hans quickly realized that he wasn't riding a bike anymore. He was a passenger on a terrifying pedal-powered missile. He hit the first curve and tried to turn, but the laws of physics laughed in his face. The bike lost all traction, sliding out from under him, but the momentum kept him moving forward at breakneck speed. He became a rag doll in a frozen washing machine, bouncing off the walls of the chute, gaining velocity with every agonizing second. The track is designed to channel objects to the bottom safely if they are sleds. It is not designed to catch flying cyclists. Hans hit the lower section of the track not as an athlete, but as a human projectile. The impact against the solid concrete barrier at the bottom, which he had ignored the existence of, was sudden, violent, and tragically inevitable. The police report noted that while his bike was a total wreck, his helmet was intact, though it couldn't protect him from the sheer G-force of the impact. Hans died instantly, a victim of his own inability to understand that rubber tires and ice are mortal enemies. He sought an adrenaline rush and found it, right up until the moment the stationary object met his very movable face. It was a cold, hard lesson in respecting the venue. If a sport requires a bodysuit and a sled, maybe don't bring a Schwinn to the party. 5. There is a special, blinding kind of rage reserved for homeowners dealing with pests. A primal anger that can completely short-circuit the part of the brain responsible for logic, reason, and not blowing yourself up. This brings us to the explosive saga of Arthur, a man who declared total, scorched earth war on a cockroach infestation in his small suburban bungalow. Arthur didn't just want to kill the bugs. He wanted to send a message to their ancestors, their descendants, and any other insect thinking of crossing his threshold. He went to the local hardware store and bought bug bombs, those aerosol foggers that hiss menacingly and fill the room with poison. The label on the can was very clear, written in bold, lawyer-approved font. Use 1 can per room. It also likely said, in equally bold letters, do not use near open flames, and do not turn your house into a fuel-air explosive. But Arthur was in a blind fury. He did the math of a madman. If 1 can is effective, 20 cans must be 20 times more effective. He wasn't fumigating, he was terraforming. He placed 20 industrial-strength foggers throughout his modest home, creating a concentration of chemicals that would be excessive for an aircraft hangar, let alone a kitchen. He depressed the tabs, heard the collective hiss of 20 cans releasing their payload, and retreated outside to wait for the insect genocide to complete. So far, so good. Or at least, so far, so alive. But as he stood on his porch, breathing the fresh air and dreaming of a bug-free utopia, he patted his pockets and realized a fatal error. His car keys were still inside on the kitchen counter. Now, a rational person would think, I'll wait 2 hours, walk to a coffee shop, or call a locksmith. Arthur, however, was not operating on rationality. He was operating on impatience. He decided to hold his breath and run back in, acting like a deep sea diver venturing into the abyss. He opened the door and was met with a wall of white fog so dense he couldn't see his hand in front of his face. The house was no longer filled with breathable air. It was filled with a highly combustible mixture of propane propellant and concentrated insecticide. He stumbled through the living room, eyes stinging, holding his breath until his lungs burned, desperately groping for the kitchen counter. In the disorienting darkness of the fog, he couldn't see a thing. Instinct, that treacherous survival mechanism, kicked in. His hand brushed against the wall, found the light switch, and before his brain could scream stop, his muscle memory flipped it. Click. That tiny, insignificant mechanism inside the switch created a microscopic spark, a small arc of electricity that usually goes unnoticed. But in an atmosphere that was essentially pre-mixed rocket fuel, that spark was the kiss of death. The ignition was instantaneous. The gas-saturated air caught fire all at once, creating a thermobaric explosion that didn't just burn the house, it disassembled it. The roof was lifted clear off the walls, the windows were blown out into the neighbor's yard, and Arthur was launched into the afterlife on a shockwave of his own making. The blast was heard for miles, confusing the local seismologists. The fire department later confirmed that the cockroaches were indeed dead, so technically, Arthur achieved his goal. He just had to sacrifice his house, his car keys, and his existence to do it. 6. The classic trope of the cat stuck in a tree usually ends with a ladder, a firefighter, or a tin of tuna and some patience. But for our next Darwin Award winner, let's call him Kevin, it ended with a physics lesson involving potential energy, elasticity, and a catastrophic failure of judgment. Kevin's cat, a feline named Mr. Whiskers who likely possessed more common sense than his owner, had climbed a large oak tree in the front yard and refused to come down. Kevin considered calling the fire department, but his pride, and perhaps a misunderstanding of how emergency services work, stopped him. Why call for help when you have a brain the size of a walnut and a sedan with a tow hitch? Kevin assessed the situation with the confidence of an engineer who skipped all the classes about forces and tension. The cat was on a long, flexible branch about 20 feet up. Kevin's plan was a masterpiece of redneck engineering. He would tie a heavy-duty rope to the branch, tie the other end to his car's rear bumper, and drive slowly forward. The idea was to gently bend the branch down to eye level, pluck Mr. Whiskers from his perch like a ripe apple, and then release the tree. It was a plan that completely ignored how trees work, how ropes work, and how the stored energy of a bent object works. He rigged up the line, got into his driver's seat, and began to inch forward. The rope went taut. The branch began to bend. Mr. Whiskers, realizing that the primate below was up to something stupid, dug his claws in deeper and held on for dear life. Kevin, looking in his rearview mirror and seeing the branch wasn't coming down low enough, decided to give it a little more gas. He pressed the accelerator. The massive oak branch groaned under the strain, bending like a giant wooden bow being drawn by an invisible titan. The tension in the rope and the wood was immense, building up thousands of pounds of potential energy. And then, physics snapped. It wasn't the rope that gave way. It was the structural integrity of the wood at the trunk. The thick branch snapped with the sound of a gunshot. Now, usually, when you tow something, you expect it to drag behind you. But this wasn't a tow. This was a launch. Freed from the immense tension, the jagged, broken branch didn't fall to the ground. It whipped back toward the source of the force with blinding speed. It became a trebuchet bolt, a wooden missile aimed directly at the car. It covered the distance in a fraction of a second, smashing through the rear window, tearing through the headrest, and impaling Kevin right where he sat in the driver's seat. He never even saw it coming. The car rolled to a stop, the engine idling. The driver permanently retired from his landscaping duties. And the punchline? Mr. Whiskers, startled by the noise of the snap and the crash, simply let go, fell through the leaves, landed on his feet, and walked back to the house to wait for dinner. Kevin died trying to save an animal that was perfectly capable of saving itself, proving that in the battle between human ingenuity and feline indifference, the cat always wins. 7. Moving day is universally recognized as one of the most stressful experiences in the human condition, ranking right up there with root canals, tax audits, and listening to someone describe their dream from the night before. But for our next contender, let's call him Bob, it was also the final day of his existence. Bob was the kind of guy who believed that paying for professional movers was a scam invented by Big Cardboard to steal his hard-earned cash. He was a DIY enthusiast, which in this case stands for Destroy It Yourself, and his pride and joy was a vintage upright piano, a musical instrument that weighed roughly as much as a Honda Civic and possessed the aerodynamic properties of a brick. Bob lived on the second floor of an apartment complex with a staircase narrower than his own ego. So naturally, instead of pivoting or hiring a crane, he decided to hoist the piano up to the balcony using a homemade pulley system. Now, a professional rigger would use industrial winches, tested steel cables, a hard hat, and a healthy fear of death. Bob, however, used a length of frayed rope he found in his garage that looked like it had survived the Civil War, and a rusty pulley that was originally designed for a clothesline, not a quarter-ton of cast iron and brass. He enlisted a few terrified friends to pull from the balcony while he stayed on the ground to supervise the operation. This is where the stupidity truly blossomed into a fatal flower. As the piano began its shaky ascent, swaying in the breeze like a pendulum of doom, Bob decided he wasn't satisfied with the trajectory. A rational person, seeing a 500-pound death box dangling precariously in the air by a thread, would stand back, way back, perhaps in a different zip code. But Bob was a micromanager. He felt the piano was swaying too much to the left. So he stepped directly underneath the suspended load, arms outstretched, intending to guide it with his bare hands. He looked like a man trying to catch a falling safe in a cartoon, genuinely believing that his fleshy, mortal arms could influence the physics of a falling Steinway. The rope, which was already screaming in protest against the laws of tension, finally gave up the ghost. It didn't fray slowly. It snapped with the violence of a whip crack. Gravity, the one law you cannot plea bargain with, took immediate effect. The piano didn't just fall, it accelerated with malicious intent. Bob, standing directly in the drop zone with his hands up like he was waiting for a basketball pass, didn't stand a chance. He didn't just get hit by the piano, he essentially caught it. The impact was instantaneous and total. One moment, Bob was shouting directions. The next, he was a two-dimensional part of the pavement. The police report was grim, noting that the piano was tuned to the key of B-flat, which is ironically what Bob became. He proved that while music can soothe the savage beast, a falling piano will absolutely flatten the savage idiot. It was a tragic, Looney Tunes-style end to a man who thought he could outmuscle physics and outsmart the moving industry, leaving behind a legacy that was, quite literally, flat. 8. Let's take a trip to the rolling hills of Tuscany, a land of romance, history, stunning sunsets, and apparently fatal fermentation accidents caused by extreme greed. Meet Lorenzo, a man who fancied himself a connoisseur of fine wines but whose budget was strictly box wine level. Lorenzo decided to bridge this gap not by working harder or buying a lottery ticket, but by breaking into a high-end vineyard cellar in the dead of night. His plan was to steal a few bottles of the good stuff, sell them on the black market, and maybe keep a vintage Chianti for himself to enjoy with some fava beans. But once inside the cellar, surrounded by the massive, towering vats of fermenting grapes, greed got the better of him. He realized that the bottled wine was just the tip of the iceberg. The real treasure was inside the vats, the fresh product still in the making. Lorenzo decided he wanted the freshest possible sample, straight from the source, like a kid sneaking cookie dough, but with much higher stakes. He climbed the metal ladder to the top of a massive, stainless steel fermentation tank, popped the heavy hatch, and peered inside. Now, here is the science lesson that Lorenzo missed in high school chemistry class. The fermentation process turns sugar into alcohol, which is great for parties, but it also produces massive amounts of carbon dioxide as a byproduct. CO2 is heavier than oxygen, meaning it doesn't float away. It sits inside the tank like an invisible, suffocating pool of gas, waiting for a victim. The tank wasn't just full of wine. The empty space at the top was a death trap of unbreathable air. Lorenzo, completely oblivious to atmospheric chemistry, leaned far over the rim to scoop up some wine with a cup, or perhaps to smell the bouquet. As he took a deep breath of what he thought was air, he inhaled a lungful of pure, concentrated CO2. The effect was instant and merciless. His brain, starved of oxygen, hit the power off button immediately. He didn't struggle. He didn't scream. He didn't even have time to regret his life choices. He simply lost consciousness and slumped forward, tumbling face first into the dark, purple liquid below. The splash was the only sound in the silent cellar. He didn't drown in the traditional sense of fighting for air. He was already gone before he hit the surface. He was found the next morning by the winemaker, floating like a tragic dumpling in a batch of award-winning red. Lorenzo died doing what he loved, drinking wine. But he did it with such aggressive stupidity that he ruined the entire batch, costing the vineyard thousands of dollars. It's a harsh lesson in industrial safety. If you want a drink, go to a bar, because the farm-to-table approach has a much higher body count than you'd expect, and the hangover from this particular vintage is permanent. 9. We all have moments of impatience, waiting for a microwave to finish popping popcorn, waiting for a red light to turn green, or waiting for a website to load. But Steve, a bachelor with a retro 1960s aesthetic and a complete lack of scientific understanding, took impatience to a terminal level. Steve owned a large, vintage-style lava lamp, a decoration that is supposed to be soothing, psychedelic, and notoriously slow to start. The way a lava lamp works is simple physics. A small, low-wattage light bulb at the base gently heats the wax, causing it to rise and fall in a mesmerizing dance. It takes about 45 minutes to an hour to get going properly. But Steve wanted his groove now. He stared at the cold, solid lump of wax and decided that the 40-watt bulb was just too inefficient for a man of his busy schedule. He wanted to turbocharge the psychedelic experience. He picked up the heavy glass vessel, walked into his kitchen, and placed it directly onto an electric stovetop burner coil. He turned the dial to high. Now, most people know that you don't put sealed glass containers on a stove. It's usually written in the instruction manual, on the box, and often on a sticker on the lamp itself. But Steve treated warning labels like the terms and conditions of a software update. He scrolled right past them without reading a single word. He stood there, arms crossed, watching the lamp, expecting to see the wax start flowing instantly. Instead, he was turning his retro decoration into a thermal pressure bomb. The liquid inside began to boil, expanding rapidly. The wax melted, but the pressure inside the sealed glass chamber skyrocketed because the gas had nowhere to go. The glass, which was decorative and not designed for culinary temperatures, reached its breaking point. There was no hiss, no warning crack to tell him to run. Just a deafening boom. The lava lamp exploded with the force of a fragmentation grenade. Shards of hot glass, boiling water, and molten chemical goo flew in every direction at hundreds of miles per hour. Steve, standing directly in front of the stove to monitor his genius life hack, took the brunt of the blast. A large, jagged shard of the thick glass casing was launched directly into his chest, piercing his heart instantly. He collapsed on his kitchen floor, surrounded by purple ooze and broken glass, a victim of the most groovy booby trap in history. He died because he couldn't wait 45 minutes for a lamp to warm up. In the end, Steve did get the lamp to flow, but the cleanup was a nightmare, and the party was definitely over. 10. There is a specific type of person who sees a beautiful, historic object and thinks, "I need that for my living room, and I'm taking it right now." This brings us to the story of Sheila, a woman whose interior design ambitions far outstripped her understanding of gravity, structural engineering, and the concept of structural integrity. Sheila was walking past a historic estate in England late one night when she spotted the perfect accessory for her garden: a massive decorative stone pineapple perched atop a brick gatepost. This wasn't a hollow plastic replica from a garden center. This was a solid, hand-carved block of limestone weighing about as much as a refrigerator, installed back in the 18th century when people built things to crush their enemies. Sheila decided she was going to liberate this pineapple. She wasn't just vandalizing, she was curating. She scaled the brick pillar, grabbing onto the iron railings, and began to wrestle with the stone fruit. It was mortared in place, but decades of English rain and frost had weakened the bond. She tugged, she pulled, and when that didn't work, she started to violently shake the entire heavy ornament. Now, here is the critical error in her physics model. She was standing directly below the object she was trying to dislodge, looking up at it, shaking it back and forth like a loose tooth. She didn't pause to consider the trajectory of a falling object. She assumed, in her theft-induced adrenaline haze, that the pineapple would gently pop off and she would catch it in her arms like a baby. Physics, however, had a different plan. With one final mighty shove, the crumbling mortar gave way. The stone pineapple, freed from its century-old prison, obeyed the law of gravity instantly. It didn't fall into her waiting arms, it fell directly onto her face. The sheer mass of the stone crushed her instantly against the gate she was clinging to, ending her career as an amateur art thief in a fraction of a second. There was no time to react, no time to regret the decision. She was found the next morning, pinned to the ground by the very object she had coveted so dearly. It was a grimly ironic tableau, the thief crushed by the loot. The pineapple was relatively unharmed, sitting triumphantly on top of her, proving that in the game of rock, paper, scissors, vandal, the rock always wins. Sheila died for a piece of garden decor, proving that some souvenirs are simply too heavy a price to pay, especially when you try to catch them with your face. If you're watching this, congratulations on surviving another day of basic decision-making. Now, I want a confession in the comments. What is a specific safety warning label that exists purely because of something stupid you once did? Spill the tea. Hit that like button if you prefer staying alive. Subscribe for more lessons in what not to do, and I'll see you in the next one.